there is a unique impact psychologically and on the brain from hearing the human voice as opposed to any other melodious sound, whether that's an instrument or an animal producing melodic sound. As a uniquely human activity that connects us body and soul species, there is nothing simpler and there is nothing kinder and there is nothing more sweet than sharing your voice.
Hi there, and welcome to This Is Why We Sing, a podcast with me, James Sills, that's all about the transformative power of singing. It's really great to have you here. In this series, I'm looking at why singing helps us to feel more human. It can help us feel more connected. It can help us to lead happier and healthier lives. And I don't want you just to take my word for it. I've been speaking to composers and authors, choir leaders, and today a music psychologist to help explain the phenomenon of singing. Today's guest is Dr. Victoria Willamson, and I've been a big admirer of her work for almost 10 years after reading her book, You Are the Music, How Music Reveals What It Means to Be Human. She's an academic and a writer, and she also appears regularly on radio and television to help explain the effect that music has on us, both as listeners and performers. This is a conversation that I've been dying to have for many, many years, and the podcast gave me the perfect opportunity to contact Victoria. We talked about so many things that I think you'll find absolutely fascinating, such as the global phenomenon of earworms, her research into amusia, also known as tone deafness, and what the implications are for singing. We also talk about, more broadly, the relationship between music and well-being, why the human voice is so powerful, and much, much more. I really think there's something in here for everybody, and if you've ever been intrigued by the effect of music on the brain, this is the conversation for you. We recorded this in lockdown in March 2021, myself in North Wales and Vicky in Barcelona. So welcome, Vicky, to the podcast. It's really exciting to have you here.
It's my pleasure.
First question that I ask everybody is, what song's in your head right now?
So this morning I have been doing some household jobs, some normal things of mum of two little ones, lots of folding, lots of cleaning, lots of picking up toys. And I've had a track called Key to My Kingdom, which is a B.B. King track, going round and round. I think it's just a nice rhythm to be doing.
Has it
all
got
of
that
this
kind of
yeah.
Fold this, put this away.
Yeah.
It's kind of keeping you moving along.
To the key to my kingdom, and your love is my crown. And you carry on. It's fantastic.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, that's great. Do you know, it's always such an illuminating question, asking people that, because it's really insightful, actually, and tells us a lot about the role that songs, kind of play in our everyday lives. But I believe that you've done some research into earworms and why certain songs get lodged in our heads. And so you might be able to explain this away for us a little bit.
Oh, I wish I could explain it away. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? So my research started from a point of very little scientific knowledge. There were very few studies of earworms in the literature when we got started. And that's always been the tradition in psychology. There's that anything that looks at imagery, at essentially what's going on as a perception inside our minds, people tend to shy away from because it's very hard. It relies on our interpretation, our descriptions, and then you're studying that. So it gets a bit far removed from the actual experience for a lot of psychologists. But I thought it's such an everyday experience. People are bound to have wonderful stories. We didn't even know how widespread it was, what the variety of the song was, whether there was an easy way to explain musically what was getting stuck. So we started with big population surveys worldwide, trying to work out how many people experience this. And there was a lovely academic in Finland called Lassi Likkonen who started at basically the same time. You know how often in science two people are doing the same thing at kind of the same time. And so we joined forces and we were able to do lots of great work together. And we found that this experience is ubiquitous. It does happen all over the world. Lots of cultures have different names for it, but this idea of a snippet of music coming unbidden to the mind and then going on repeat outside of conscious control, just about every culture recognizes that phenomenon. There will always be a few people who say, I've never had that happen to me. So it doesn't happen to every single human being, but the vast majority, we're talking 90-95%, depending on the country, will say, yep, that happens to me on a fairly regular basis.
So you're talking there about, the difficulty, I guess, of doing what you do. As a music psychologist, in terms of kind of, tying together these experiences that people have with what's going on in the brain, maybe you could just explain a little bit about what a music psychologist actually is, because we've on the podcast we've had choir leaders and composers and songwriters and authors, but it'd be really interesting to find out exactly, what a music psychologist is and does.
So music psychology as a discipline is fairly young. It has its roots in the sort of 1930s and 40s when people were trying to understand the roots of a lot of human intelligences. What is it that makes certain people good at certain things and not others? So that's when people like Carl Seashore started to investigate what is it that makes some people appear to be very musical when young and others not so much. In the 60s and 70s, the sort of grandmothers of the discipline were people like Carol Krumhansel and Diana Deutsch over in the States, and they started to investigate the psychological reality of music in our minds. Why is it that certain tones are so prominent? How is it that we come to understand scales? Why is it that our memories work in certain ways? So those studies started to gain some traction. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, when neuroimaging took off, we were able to start hunting for music in the brain. And that's when everything kind of exploded.
That's when it gets exciting. So neuroimaging, is that when we see those pictures of the brain with the different colours lighting up with different...
Exactly. So it basically means taking an image of the brain. And you can do that in various ways. You can look at it almost like an X-ray, and you can look at the structure of someone's brain. You can say, I'll take a musician and a non-musician. What is it about the structures of their brain that might be different? That's one way to do it. Then you can do it where you're sort of looking at an X-ray, but it's an X-ray that lights up in different colours. That's the type of scan which is looking at where the brain is using oxygen during a task. So what parts of the brain are basically likely to be active or engaged in whatever stimulus is going on. And then you can say, okay, when somebody is listening to this type of music, what parts of the brain light up as opposed to their very favourite bit of music, for example. So you can look at the active processing of music. And then finally, there's the electrical activity of the brain. So that's the very, very quick responses of everything from the brain stem up, where you can see in microsecond time what is the different reaction across the brain as music is unfolding.
Wow. And you say it's a relatively new discipline, but I imagine the scope must be absolutely massive.
Absolutely. So psychology is the understanding of human mind and behaviour, and music psychology is the understanding of all of our mind and our behaviours that involve music. So you can do that across the whole of the human lifespan. You can do it cross-culturally. You can look at the brain. You can look at the body-brain interaction. I mean, whatever tool you enjoy and whatever musical environment or age of life is your bag, there's something for you.
Absolutely, yeah. And just talking about across the lifespan, I've got to do a shout out for your fantastic book. You Are the Music, How Music Reveals What It Means to Be Human. And I really love the way in the book, Victoria, how you kind of take the reader through every life stage, starting, before birth, when we're, absorbing music in the womb, right through to the very end of life. It's a really, really fascinating guide that I'd really recommend to anybody who wants to understand, the effect that music has on us. So thank you for that. It was really, really illuminating for me to look at it in that way, because in my work as a singing leader, I'm trying to put forward the view that not just music is for everybody in terms of engaging it and performing, but singing. And one of the biggest things I hear the most is when I have these conversations with people, and the first things that people often say is, "Oh well, there's no way that I can sing because I'm tone deaf." I wonder if you could tell me a bit about this concept of tone deafness, and the technical term is amusia. Is that right?
Yes. So congenital amusia is a human experience that I have investigated as well. So the idea of tone deafness, that's the sort of colloquial term that we use. And some of the first studies sought to understand what is the difference between the number of people who state that they are tone deaf and the people who actually have a music processing difficulty. And you can almost consider this to be akin to other processing difficulties with stimuli in the world, whether that's dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysphasia, or prosopagnosia, which is the difficulty in developing an understanding for the human face.
Right.
So there's all kinds of stimuli out there where, for whatever reason, the brain develops in a way where the processing of that stimulus is difficult for the person. And amusia should be dysmusia, in my opinion, because amusia implies lack of music. Amusics don't completely lack music. There's a difficulty, there's a disturbance in the processing within their brain. So one of the first studies gathered a large population from an American college and said, okay, how many of you guys are tone deaf? Oh, a few hands went up. Somewhere between 15 to 20% of the kids put their hand up and say, yeah,
That's interesting. You know what? The people I meet, just kind of regularly day to day, I would say almost like 50%. As soon as they hear that you're someone who gets people singing, "Oh, I'm tone deaf."
Oh yeah, that's a different thing. That's like, don't make me sing.
Yeah. Well, that's it. That's true. Yeah, but so it's quite a significant people, identified.
Yeah, somewhere around a fifth to a quarter, depending on the size sample of people. So can you guess what proportion of those students actually appeared to measure as being congenital amusic when they were tested with the Montreal battery for the evaluation of amusia? How many?
I suspect it's very, very small. So I don't know, maybe say 5%.
Very good guess. Yeah, between 4 and 5%.
Yeah.
Which is completely sort of in line with some of the other processing difficulties like prosopagnosia. It tends to be somewhere between 3 to 5% of the population will actually score below the cutoff that they have a significant processing difficulty in that area.
And so if we look at how this would then affect people engaging in singing, what's the barrier that that would create? So
congenital amusia, I should also mention it's possible to have acquired amusia. And actually, the difference is congenital. Somebody has always had a disrupted relationship with music as long as they can remember. Somebody with acquired amusia had a normal, for them, relationship with music up to a certain point where something happened. And this could be a brain injury, it could be a stroke, could be a serious illness that affected the brain, and from then on there is a disruption to their music processing.
And so with the acquired amusia, it's not that they've just had a very kind of barren musical life and those parts of the brain switch off. It's something physical, some physical changes that have happened.
Exactly, that's acquired amusia. And acquired amusia is a fairly common symptom in the first few days after stroke, actually. It's very common for people to believe that music sounds weird or to struggle with the processing, understanding, even the production of musical sound. It's also one of the most common to recover from as well.
Right, okay.
So there's a higher proportion of acquired amusia in the population at any one point, but because it's a sudden onset illness thing, you never know how many people are going to recover from that.
Sure.
Congenital amusics don't necessarily have a dearth of exposure to music in their childhood that could explain it. We found many congenital amusics who actually came from incredibly musical cultures and societies. I'm thinking of a family in Ireland that we got very close to at some point, where some of the family members, some of the siblings were incredibly musical and took part in community music, and music was just all around them. But despite this, quite heavy exposure to music growing up, they weren't able to process it, and for that reason they weren't able to enjoy it for the most part. But congenital amusia is first and foremost a perception problem. So what's being perceived isn't right.
So it's what's going into the ears.
Exactly. So people will say the singing is wrong, but that's because there's no corrective feedback coming in that could let the person know it's wrong. If somebody comes to you and say, I am an absolutely terrible singer, I bet my bottom dollar they're not an amusic. And amusic is far more likely to come to you and say, everybody tells me I'm a terrible singer. I don't know one way or the other.
But I can't tell because I'm not able to process those sounds in a way that would tell me I'm terrible. Right. Interesting. So it's like, I'm trying to remember, it's that those kind of stages of learning, isn't it? You know, so you kind of have the when you're always, you know, you're unconsciously incompetent and then you're consciously incompetent. I'm trying to remember where that's from. But is that kind of a lame, you know, for me, like a layman's term of explaining that? So if you have congenital amusia, you're not conscious that you know that you're not able to sing well. Whereas if you know you're not affected by that and you may be out of practice or you need a bit of guidance, then you are aware that your voice doesn't match up to what your expectation is.
And what you're hearing around you, yeah. If you're very aware, if you're able to reflect on your own sound and compare it to what you hear around you, then your perception is probably working pretty well. And it's more to do with, say, vocal strength, confidence. Somebody's knocked you down at some point, said you can't sing, so you haven't really had time to develop those feedback skills. We did a lovely study with a master's student in Goldsmiths at the University of London, Sue, who's an absolutely wonderful singing teacher. She had absolute pitch, and she was so empathetic and so encouraging. And she took some of it was actually a group of ladies in the end, not by design, just happened. They volunteered. Yes, I'd like to try singing. And it was really fascinating, actually, because they loved being together in a social. They'd never met, because it's quite rare, they'd never met anybody with congenital amusia before. So the half a dozen of them together, they were really sparking, and they really enjoyed the singing lessons that Sue gave them. And we did see an improvement in some of them, in some of their singing when we were measuring things like their pitching and things like that. What didn't improve was their scores on the Montreal Battery for the evaluation of amusia. So having singing lessons didn't improve their amusia per se, but the sound that they were making was, for many of them, improving. And the most interesting thing about that is that we talked about it a lot, and my favourite theory that came out of it was actually they were learning alternative feedback measures. They were learning to recognise different ways to assess whether their singing was likely to be good or bad. That could be they were monitoring the musculature in the throat or the use of their mouth, or they were getting around the perception issue, essentially.
Interesting. Wow, so interesting. Well, that gives me a whole list of things I can say to people now when they come approach me and they said I can't sing because I'm tone deaf. So, well, have you considered this? And one thing you mentioned there, why people may be apprehensive about singing is that, it may be that something that was said to them, when they were younger. And this is, again, something that I come across a lot in my work. It could be a teacher or it could be a family member.
Right.
And they might only need to hear it once, and then that's enough to turn them off singing. So why is that, do you think, like, Victoria? I mean, why do we take that so personally to the point that, a lot of people just simply stop singing?
It's a very strong aversion reaction, isn't it? It's almost like, it reminds me of food aversions. If you're eating something as a child and you become ill, even by coincidence, you might have a stomach bug. The child will never eat that food again. It just takes once to that aversion response to be so strong. I think singing is very natural for children. I say my two little ones are singing all the time, whether or not they're aware of it. They're running little tunes through their head. So to be told that isn't good enough is probably strikes very to the core of something that's that's fundamental to the way that they've started to learn and interact with their environment, suddenly they're told you're not doing it right. And because we're vocal, because we're vocal, it's just easy enough to say, well, I won't do that vocal activity. I can talk and you understand me and things like that. It's easy enough not to do.
It is really interesting, isn't it? Because my kids are very similar age to yours, and mine are very much at the stage where they're just really exploring like the whole sound world, and kind of singing is part of that, but I don't know whether they necessarily think of singing as something that's particularly separate from everything else. And you just kind of want to keep them in this space where, it's not just singing, it's kind of just creativity and, all these things that somehow, I'm thinking of that, that great Ken Robinson TED Talk, where he talks about these things kind of gradually being, almost squeezed out of us as we get older. And that's, for me, that's so sad, because you're just turning off these really important facets of what it means to be human, whether it's singing or whether it's creativity, it's so fundamental to our well-being, which I know is an area that you're particularly interested in. We said that music psychology is an incredible, such a broad scope. Right. But I know that kind of music and wellness and well-being is something that you're particularly interested in. Is that right?
Yes, over the years I've become more so. Yes, I started as a very what would be the appropriate term? Straight-laced reductionist psychologist. That was my training, very classical psychology experiments in the lab, and I slowly moved out into the real world, and it was impossible to not be captivated by and fascinated by the potential well-being benefits of music. And as you say, these may be things that we have within us to do for our own well-being. And we listen to music. But the interactive part of music, the social part of music, the performance part of music really somehow gets taken out of life quite early on, depending on the education system. And we, through sort of lack of exposure and practice, I suppose, it becomes less of an intuitive, why don't I just sing? It's right, exactly. I'm not feeling right. Why don't I belt out a few numbers and see if I feel a bit better after that? Yeah. We get used to listening to music and sort of being insular in that way with our music. But the creative, the creation, the exploration, the sound production, that does get minimized. But when we look at how music is used for well-being, whether it's as in a medical setting, and that might be musicians who are specially trained to work in care, all the way through to music therapists who are operating in a professional therapeutic forum with the appropriate training and guidance in order to work properly with clients with a range.
That's right.
I mean, you see them in neonatal units in hospitals, you see them helping people recovering from stroke, you see them working with non-verbal autistic spectrum children, all the way through to end-of-life care and coma. And I've seen musicians and music therapists work in all these environments, and I'm just fascinated by the impact that they have. And if I can do nothing else, it's very hard to study, obviously. In most cases, you're trying to capture something and measure something that's not only multifaceted, but so individual. But if I can do nothing else, hopefully in my position of illuminating these circumstances, I can advocate that this part of our creative world, and this is within the vast, vast majority of us, is there. It's right there as an opportunity to enhance wellness. So let's get on it.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, yes. But I also think you're advocating it in a really brilliant way, because obviously you're coming from your kind of academic background. But, I think I first heard you were talking on Six Music, and then obviously your book and your TED Talks. And I think it's really fantastic that your message is getting out there, but isn't just isn't confined to the world of academia, which is obviously very important in itself. But to get this message out, because well-being is something that affects all of us. I mean, would it be useful just to define what we mean by well-being, because it's a word that's become even more kind of in vogue or whatever the last few years. Like, I mean, you used it in your book. There's a chapter on music and well-being. I know that over the last few years you've helped establish, a kind of a course in music and well-being at the University of Sheffield, and I feel, for me, that feels like a big direction of travel. Moving towards social prescribing more and more. So, there's just so much we could talk about here. Let's just talk about, first of all, what we mean by well-being.
Yeah.
If it's possible to have a neat definition.
Well, the World Health Organization provided a definition, which is where we can start, which is that well-being is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So I like that definition in that it gives us a state to strive towards that isn't just I'm feeling well in that I'm not feeling ill. Well-being is about maximizing the multiple facets of human experience such that we feel good about each of them. And the World Health definition incorporates physical, mental, and social. When I looked at well-being in brass band members, which I did last year, I think that paper was published.
Oh, interesting. That was my background, growing up in Yorkshire, playing the trombone in the brass band.
Oh, very proud musical tradition in Yorkshire and in a lot of other places, in Wales, of course. Wonderful tradition there. So when myself and Dr. Michael Bonshaw, who is a fellow choir leader, lovely chap, were looking at getting reports from brass band players about how their brass band life impacted on their well-being, we used 5 different prompts. We looked at physical, psychological, emotional, social, and spiritual. The main differences there are to separate out psychological and emotional, because in terms of psychological, I wanted people to be able to separate out things like stress and depression and anxiety, psychological states, from emotional. So simply the highs and lows, the happiness and the sadness and whatever other emotion you wanted to talk about. And also to include spiritual, which I think is a very underrepresented area of well-being. And it's about that feeling of being connected to something that isn't just social. Social is there to represent our connection to our society, to our community. But the brass band players told us in many cases about feeling connected to something larger than themselves. And that would be the spiritual aspect, feeling spiritually settled and spiritually fulfilled by music performance.
So it just shows how much there is going on, because there's at least kind of 3 levels. There's your individual engagement, I suppose, with the music and the musical experience, and then there's the broader social aspect, whether it's the brass band or the choir with whom you're singing. But then absolutely, then there's that kind of extra level that music takes you somewhere else, that gives you that spiritual dimension, and I guess that starts to explain why it is so powerful. And for me, the kind of extra layer with singing is just the fact that you are singing songs, and that songs are incredibly powerful. In episode 8 of the podcast, I was speaking to Eric Whittaker, the choral composer, and he said he writes a lot of instrumental music, and he writes mainly choral music. But he said it's really the choral music where he feels that he can kind of aim for the really aim for the heavens, really. He said there's something about when voices come together that just really elevates everything we've been talking about. Is that something you've kind of come across in your research?
Well, definitely. It's an effect that's been replicated multiple times, that there is a unique impact psychologically and on the brain from hearing the human voice, as opposed to any other melodious sound, whether that's an instrument or an animal producing melodic sound. There is something that captures our brain about hearing our own human voice. So there's always going to be something special about singing, in my opinion. And it's something that often elevates composers in the minds of others as well, is that if they're able to write beautifully for the human voice, then they have an extra level of understanding of the complexion of music. I mean, if you think of all the great composers, the vast majority of them, from Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, they all wrote for the human voice.
Of course.
Constanza, Mozart's wife, Constanza, he wrote beautiful vocal music for her, and she always said that she felt he had a unique understanding of the possibility of the human voice for making music.
Yeah, and just as we were talking, I was just thinking about, like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, like how do you elevate this form even more? Let's introduce the chorus to it.
And isn't there something about the Ninth as well, that he's deaf by then? And there's something about that chorus when I always hear it, I think he's desperate to hear this. He's desperate to push the human voice almost to its limit in a desperate attempt to hear it.
For me, this feels like a really exciting time, because a lot of the things we're talking about seem to be manifesting themselves in lots of ways. I'm thinking, for example, about the research and a lot of new initiatives around music and dementia with singing in particular. Mm-hmm. Are there any particular areas that you're aware of, that feel kind of particularly exciting, or, in 5 or 10 years' time, what might the conversations around singing and well-being be about? Have you got any sense of where things might be going?
Yeah, great question. So you're absolutely right. There's been a buzz for a little while about the promise of singing as part of care for people who are living with dementia-related illnesses, mm-hmm. and not only the way in which that can provide one of the really important pathways for well-being when you're living with dementia, which is sort of cruelly stripped away by the nature of that disease, which is the ability to have a social connection with other human beings. It's such an isolating illness, and to be able to interact in a way, because you don't need to be verbal, of course. Singing just sound with another human being, doesn't have to be words, is a way to establish a relationship with another person, to maintain a thread with the outer world, to have a communicative experience and an interaction. So there's so much possibility there to tackle many of the difficult well-being challenges that somebody faces throughout their journey living with dementia-related illnesses. But you've also got to consider the physical promise of singing and what it can provide for somebody. So I, as well as the work going on in dementia care, I would think in the next 5 years, I would be surprised if we didn't start to see some form of prescription going on for people with breathing difficulties for singing.
Yeah, well, we're starting to see this at the moment for people who are affected by long COVID. I don't know if you saw the English National Opera initiative, and there's quite a few people in that field. But yeah, absolutely, yeah. No, again, that's one of the things that for me feels quite exciting. Like, we're almost at the cusp of exploring the possibilities.
Yes, yeah. That really is. I used to have great conversations with the staff at the Sheffield Hallamshire Hospital when I was involved in Sheffield University there. And Professor Ian Sabra in particular, who's the head of immunology, and he's a lung expert, and he was absolutely, convinced of the benefits of this kind of music care for somebody who it could have any sort of degree of breathing challenge to live with. It could be asthma, it could be COPD, it could be anything really that affects the ability to breathe. It could even, in this day of so many of us sitting, slumped over, having good posture.
Absolutely,
isn't that a wonderful thing to encourage? To sing properly, to learn to engage the core, to engage the diaphragm, to elongate the throat, to drop the shoulders, all of these things. So I see breath and posture, spinal care being one of the future avenues where we'll hopefully see more and more support from proper randomized controlled trials, which are going on, with places like the British Lung Foundation is supporting this, Singing for Breath, these kind of organizations, everything's moving in that direction. It takes time with proper randomized controlled trials to really, because you've got to make sure you know what you're talking about and that it's done properly. It's not just, go away and sing, you'll feel better. For each person, what is the nature of their challenge and what is the kind of singing that will not only help them, but that will excite them? Because you want somebody to be able to be motivated to continue with this kind of therapy, because that's when it'll work, when they want to do it day after day. So the great thing about music on top of everything else is that it can be individualized for that person.
Yeah, and you made such an important point there as well about, and this is why your work is so important and that of your peers, is that a lot of these things we kind of intuitively know if we've engaged with the singing experience about, it makes us feel good and we breathe and we relax. But if we're talking about working with specific groups, like you mentioned, like people with long COVID or with breathing difficulties or whatever, we have to, it has to be properly informed.
Yeah.
And it can't be, let's just have a sing-song and we'll all feel better.
Right.
And that's why that's just something I'm really, really interested in, so I'm really, really clear when I run my singing groups, I say, I'm not trying to medicalize it in a way, I can tell people that, singing is great for sense of community and catharsis and releasing your emotions, but I would never say, oh, it's going to help you, to recover. Just what I'm doing is going to help you recover from such and such. And I think this possibly is another area, of growth.
It's a part of it. In many of the larger hospitals in the States now, if you had a stroke and were taken to one of these big medical centers like Johns Hopkins or Mount Sinai, within 48 hours of the immediate aftermath, you would be assigned a physiotherapist, a speech therapist, and a music therapist.
Really? And so this is happening now in the States?
Right. That music therapy it's not going to cure anything in of itself, but it's a really important team member. This has to be a team effort. You wouldn't just say, oh, I'll just take the drugs and I'll skip the physio and I'll skip everything else, I mean, why wouldn't you try the best package? Why wouldn't you take everything that could possibly improve your well-being, especially when it gives you back a degree of control? Your doctor is going to prescribe the drugs, the physiotherapist is going to be in charge of the movement. You can begin to run your singing care. You need to be advised. You need to, as you were rightly saying, James, you need to have the right kind of information about what it is that will best help. And you need to have the guidance. And you may, in early days, need a real proper one-to-one interaction with a trained therapist. But music is something that you can go from intuitive to informed use for your well-being.
Brilliant. And I think that's just what you're doing so well in your work, Vicky. So please keep on keeping on. I know you've got your website I imagine a lot of listeners will be interested to know more and to explore many of the strands that we've been discussing. So there's your website, which is musicpsychology.co.uk, and there's of course your book, which I've mentioned, You Are the Music. Are there any other kind of books or starting points, or if people are interested in this, that you might point them towards, other than your own website and your book, which would be the first port of call?
You're too kind. Yeah, so the website is an education blog, essentially. So there's never ever any advertising on there, and it's only Muggins here writing it and putting it together. So you can feel that's a safe space where everything was curated by me, and you're not going to be taken off anywhere weird. But there are links on there. I provided... So rather than hunting around in YouTube yourself, you can go to my blog and you will find there a list of nice academic talks on a range of subjects. So that's a place to start down that rabbit hole if you would like to.
Yeah, there's loads on there. I'd really recommend it.
There's essentially, if somebody's interested in a particular aspect of well-being, more and more nowadays, you can find specific organisations that are involved in providing information as well as treatment for those conditions. I couldn't possibly name check them all, but it's a really good idea, James, that maybe I should start having a page where details can be there as a one-stop shop.
Sorry,
yeah.
not wanting to create more work for you here.
No, it's a great idea because there are so many organisations, many of them local, but a lot of them national as well. Gosh, I feel like if I start name checking, that would be slightly unfair.
Okay, so maybe go back to your website at some point in the future, and there might be some more information there.
Yes.
Thank you. So we have a podcast playlist where I invite each guest to contribute a track that is important to them in some way. Mm-hmm. So what song can we add for you?
Please may I have Sitting on the Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding.
You certainly may, yeah. Tell me why that song in particular.
It's my favourite song. I know I shouldn't have one
next
as a music psychologist, but
No,
throughout my life, I am drawn to his voice. I always have been for as long as I can remember. But that particular track is just so haunting, so simple, so subtle, and so peaceful. And the whole track itself, and from the opening crashing waves to the simple bass line, if you just take in the imagery and the stillness of, I mean, I'm a creature who's very happy when I'm near water, so I've always lived by a river or by the sea. So a track that has that is like the cherry on the top.
Actually got there's not many tracks that use that kind of folio,
No.
Blackbird by the Beatles and things like that. But you're right,
Exactly.
yeah, that's quite unusual for a pop song to have that. And I guess there's also a poignancy with that song, and that wasn't that the last song that Otis Redding recorded before he died?
It's definitely one of the final tracks before his plane crashed into a bay and he was killed. So it's got
Is that right? Oh god, I didn't know there was that extra layer of goodness.
Yeah, so there's a very poignant story behind it, but it's just his voice. It's just like caramel on ice cream. It's just smooth as silk, sweet, contrasting. It's so emotive and so empathic for me. I would wrap myself in his voice any day of the week, and I would be at peace.
Great. Well, I shall add it to the playlist, and the link to the playlist will be in the show notes, so you can listen to that song and all the other the choices by everyone who's been on the podcast this series. So thank you. I'll add that, and it's always nice. I always go away and listen to the tracks from the guests, and it really helps me to reconnect to old songs and connect to new ones. So thank you for that. Finally, Vicky, I also ask every guest, what life lesson can we take from the singing experience? So again, come at this from whatever angle you may choose. But yeah, what can we take away from the singing experience as a life lesson?
I'm gonna say that it offers you a unique communicative channel, and that can be with your own soul, that can be with your own memories, and it can also be with other people of all ages and of all stations in life, irrespective of where they are in the world. So as a uniquely human activity that connects us body and soul and species, there is nothing simpler, and there is nothing kinder, and there is nothing more sweet than sharing your voice.
You heard it here from a music psychologist, people. Thank you so much, Victoria. That was just a beautiful, beautiful way to close the conversation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I just love that. There's nothing simpler or kinder or sweeter than sharing your voice. How wonderful. Thanks very much to Vicky for today's conversation. And if that, like me, has piqued your interest in music psychology and music and the brain, I really would recommend her website, musicpsychology.co.uk, and there's a whole range of resources there. It's a real treasure trove, so do check that out. And I would heartily recommend her book, You Are the Music. It's a fantastic introduction to some of the themes that we talked about today, and it really shines a light on the effect that music and singing has throughout our lives. In the show notes, you'll also find a link to Vicky's TED Talk on music and memory, as well as the podcast playlist, where you'll find the choices by all of the guests from this series. There's some absolutely brilliant tracks on there, including Vicky's choice of Otis Redding's Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, so you can have a cup of tea, sit back and relax and enjoy that song. This is the penultimate episode of the podcast for Series 1, and I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you so much to everybody who's taken the time to get in touch with me, who's commented on one of my social media posts or sent me an email or a private message. It really means the world to me, and it makes me so happy that the word is getting out there about singing, and that quite a few people have said to me I might actually start thinking about singing again, which is job done for me. You can find the link to all of my social media handles in the show notes. Do get in touch, it's lovely to hear from you. And I'll be back next time with another episode of This Is Why We Sing, for another inspiring and insightful perspective on singing and what it means to be human. So thanks very much, take care, see you next time.